source of these breccias, and in fact you've got a really big, look at this, that's one class there, sitting in the breccia. You've got another little breccia right here in front of us which we didn't see back there. It pinches out so you don't see it, but that's a single class, so that gives you an idea of how poorly sorted this thing is. What's the class made of? What's that surface there that I'm pointing at? Yeah, it's a cleavage surface. Okay, so this is a chunk of slate, just like what we saw in the basement. Now, one point of confusion, I'm glad someone asked me this. They said, oh, but the basement's down there. How did it get from there to there? But remember, the basement's also over there. Okay, and it keeps going for a couple of thousand kilometres. Okay, so these blocks didn't come from the basement immediately underlying here. It came from whatever was uphill somewhere. Okay, it's a little bit hard to try and pick paleocurrent directions here, but if you look at the published literature, the flow direction of this stuff is probably similar to its dip. Okay, the hint of it, Ron talked about the coastline, where the coastline was yesterday afternoon. The Permian coastline, and it was probably pretty similar to what our current coastline is. Okay, so to the east was ocean and to the west was mountains. Okay, so the transport direction, very broadly speaking, would have been towards the east or the northeast, or somewhere in between there. Of course, you can look for sedimentary structures to give you things like parallel current directions. They're a little bit hard to see in these. I can't really say I've seen anything that's convincingly cross-bedding. I think we did we see some of that here, Al? Yeah. So look in some of the sandier layers.
Yeah, it's in the conglomerates. You sort of see it. These gravel.
Yeah. So these gravelly layers.
Yeah.
If you look closer at some of those, there's a feature called imbrication, where the cobbles actually stack up against each other, and they lean upwards. Is their leaning upward direction is downstream. It's like a stack of cards that have fallen over, or a stack of books. Okay. I wouldn't worry too much about the paleocurrent direction. There's some dipping surfaces there. Yeah, that may be cross-bedding there. I'm not 100% convinced. But the next question, the bigger question now to think about is the environment of deposition. And all these little gravelly layers within the sand. What else did Angelos talk about? Where's Al gone? Behind me. Yeah, so he was talking about bullet-shaped clasts in these gravelly layers, and I think to an extent in the breccias as well.
Some of the larger fragments.
Yeah, some of these larger fragments.
Like that one,
yeah, in fact, that's a good one. So there's, by bullet-shaped clasts, they're, if you were to do a crystal equivalent, they're prismatic. So they've got two short dimensions and a long one. Okay, so they're not equidimensional. They're not tabular, so they haven't got one short dimension and two longer ones. They've got two short dimensions and one long one. Okay, so they're sort of like a simple geometry. Something like a rectangular prism, but of course they're a little bit rounded, so bullet's probably a good analogy. Okay, so lots of bullet-shaped clasts. And they tend to also be pointy at one end. And the pointy bit points downstream. Okay, of course, obviously there's a lot of variation in there, and a lot of randomness, but if you take a catalogue of these class shapes, overall it gives you the current direction is that way. The other thing that supports that is if you follow these breccia horizons, they thin out very rapidly, like towards the northeast there. So they thin out to a point. Even that really big layer that's up here further, which is probably 4 or 5 metres thick, you can chase it round. You can see it over there halfway up the cliff on the other side. You can trace it around the other side of the headland, but it very rapidly dwindles out to a point. Okay, so they're wedge-shaped pieces of breccia. Not pieces, that wasn't the right word. They're wedge-shaped bodies of breccia that thin out quite rapidly to the northeast. So that again suggests that they've come from the opposite direction. Now the environment, as I said up the top there, the environment of deposition of these things has been interpreted as littoral, so meaning shallow marine. Now yet the characteristics of this sandstone alone, with these little gravelly layers in it, is much more typical of a braided stream environment. Okay, that is not, you don't get those sorts of deposits in a marine setting. That's fluvial.
Exactly, alluvial fan.
Yeah, so something like an alluvial fan. Remember what was the climate we were talking about very late yesterday afternoon? What was the climate like again?
Cold.
Cold, there was glaciation around. I don't know how much geography, physical geography done. There's things called eskers, which emanate from the terminal moraine lakes of glaciers, and they wander across a braid plain. Okay, so think of them as simply as a braided stream environment. These breccias too, a breccia like that, it's very difficult to deposit something like that in a shallow marine environment. You see terrestrial versions of it, you see them in deep marine, where you've had things like collapse of the shelf, and you get these massive events of shelf collapse, and you get huge blocks. Out in the central west, there's blocks of limestone that are up to 1 kilometre long, which have been formed in a major catastrophic event and ended up in the deep water. And they're all sitting in breccias. A bit different to these. The ones out there, the deep marine breccias tend to be matrix supported. What do I mean by matrix supported? Yeah, the sedimentologists talk about a percentage matrix versus class, but the simpler way to think about it is if they're matrix supported, the class aren't touching. They're held apart. What do you think this is? Class supported or matrix supported?
Class supported.
Yeah, it looks more class supported, doesn't it? It's a bit variable because with such poor sorting, it's difficult to say what you call a class and what you call matrix. Okay. So I'm not favouring the littoral environment. It doesn't make sense.
You might expect to see bidirectional cross beds and things like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so well, good point. So if you have got a littoral environment, you might expect to see the effects of tides. So you might expect bidirectional current flows, and we don't see that. There is mentioned in the intro there that rare marine fossils have been found in this sequence, but that's actually further up the Wasp Head Formation. It's not here. Angelos, who some of you met last year or the year before, spent days looking around here with a student, and they did not find a single fossil. Okay. So now I don't know the exact environment of these, but if you're thinking about glaciers being around, how might that material have been moved? Okay, so that's moraine material, so that's how moraines form. So glacial moraines is where all the material that's been plucked up by the glacier, where the glacier terminates and melts or is even retreating, you get a big pile up of rocks.
What about landslide?
That are basically dumped there by the melting ice. Landslide, what's it sliding off and what's it sliding onto?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So what at the end of a glacier, we mentioned moraines, so you get terminal moraines. What's sitting behind the moraine on the glacier side, other than the glacier? Yeah, you get a lake, so you get glacial moraine lakes. So, the way I'd like to sort of think of these things is that you had glacial moraine lakes. In the front of them, you've got a big pile of moraine material, which probably looks pretty similar to that. And if you get melting episodes, you get spring, well, during spring you get spring thaws. So you're likely to have quite massive floods. It's not unheard of for glacial terminal moraine lakes for the moraine to be breached during melting events, and then you get this massive instant flood. Just whoosh, and then it takes all the material that's in the moraine and smears it out over the terrain that's down towards the coast. So I'd like to think of these, and I'm no sedimentologist, I just like the story. It makes sense to me that this is moraine material that's been redistributed probably in a very sudden, well, I guess you could call it a landslide in a way, but it's a flood. And so it's been smeared out into this wedge shape. And they all do the same thing.
David was just saying that a couple of you have noticed that there are some vertical structures through
Sandstone?
through the sandstone and the breccias. Yeah, those things. And they've got nothing to do with the deposition of the rocks. They form much later. They're joints. Basically just cracks that have formed through that sandstone as it's been unloaded and exposed. And that sort of dark browny colour is probably a lot of iron oxide that's precipitated out along those fractures from groundwater that's passed through them. And that's really got nothing to do with the depositional history of the rock at all.